The night the Ottoman Empire fired on itself did not begin with a battle cry. It began with domestic sounds, the scrape of sandals on stone, the muted clink of metal, the low murmur of men who had lived too long with weapons close enough to sleep beside. It began in Istanbul, in the summer of 1826, with a city holding its breath the way a body does right before impact. And it began with a cauldron, not a crown, not a flag, not a holy book, a cooking pot. Because for centuries the most feared infantry corps in the empire had been bound together not just by pay and discipline, but by food, by the idea of eating from the same pot, being of the same ladle, living as a single body. Their cauldrons were more than cookware. They were symbols of unity, hierarchy, obedience. In the barracks, the cauldron was a hearth. In politics, it became a lever. When that cauldron was overturned, it meant rebellion. On that night, the cauldrons were overturned again. The old signal, the old threat, the old promise, we can paralyze the capital if we choose. But the empire had learned to stop negotiating with the pot. In the darkness, artillery was moved into place. That is the first shock you should sit with. For hundreds of years, the state had cultivated an elite force so powerful that it could intimidate the throne, until the only way left to solve the problem was to blast its own barracks with cannon fire. The second shock comes right after, and it is worse, because the Janissary Corps, Yenicheri Ojo, the hearth of the new soldiers, did not begin as a gang of kingmakers. It began as a system that turned children into state property. If you want to understand how an institution becomes elite, then becomes untouchable, then becomes intolerable, you don't start on the battlefield. You start in villages where nobody expected history to knock at the door. The Ottoman Empire built one of the earliest and most effective standing infantry forces in its region, long before many of its rivals could fully match it. The Janissaries were trained, paid, and housed as a permanent household military of the Sultan, part of the Kapıkulu, the slaves of the port, a term that sounds like insult until you realize what it meant in practice: direct attachment to the ruler, and therefore access to privilege that ordinary subjects could never dream of. They were not feudal levies, they were not seasonal volunteers, they were a machine designed for continuity. And machines need raw material. For a long time, that raw material came through Devşirme, a levy that in European memory hardened into a single phrase: the blood tax. The empire periodically collected boys from Christian families in the Balkans and nearby regions. Not always everywhere, not always evenly, not always the same way across centuries, but the logic remained chillingly consistent. Select young boys, remove them from their families, convert them to Islam, re-educate them in language and custom, then funnel them into service of the state. Some into administration and palace education, some into military units, and some, eventually, into the Janissary Corps. You can dress this up in bureaucratic language, recruitment, training, social mobility, but at its center is an unsettling truth. The empire created loyalty by severing the loyalties that came first. A boy taken young enough could be shaped before memory hardened. Taken early, he could be taught to think in the empire's grammar, to pray in the empire's cadence, to salute in the empire's rhythm. He would be given a new name, a new social family, a new set of rules that functioned like a second skin. He would be told again and again that his worth was obedience, that his pride was belonging, that his honor was service to a sultan he might never meet. And then, after the cutting and polishing, he would be armed. The empire did something many states only dreams of. It built an army that did not owe its first allegiance to land, clan, or local lord. It built soldiers who were not from here in the sense that makes rebellion easy, because their here had been destroyed and replaced. That is why the Janissaries could be frighteningly effective, not because they were monsters, but because they were engineered. It is also why they became terrifying to the very people who engineered them. The Janissary Corps, Yenicheri Ojo, the hearth of the new soldiers, did not begin as a gang of kingmakers. It began as a system that turned children into state property. Early ideals emphasized cohesion and restraint. They were supposed to be a closed, controlled corps, tied to the sultan, separated from civil life, focused on war and order. For a time, that design worked with almost brutal efficiency. The world remembers the Ottoman Empire's expansion with maps and dates, but expansion has a texture on the ground. It sounds like marching feet. It smells like powder and horse sweat. It feels like walls shaking under siege. The Janissaries helped provide that texture. They were among the forces that made Ottoman armies formidable in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially as firearms became more significant. They were not the only force in the Ottoman system, far from it. Cavalry, artillery, engineers, irregular raiders, provincial troops, the empire was a complex military ecosystem. But the Janissaries became a symbol because symbols are simpler than ecosystems. They were the face of the Sultan's fist. Here is where the story becomes more intricate and more sinister, because an elite unit does not only win wars, it changes the state that owns it. As Janissaries gained reputation, they gained leverage. As they gained leverage, they gained the ability to negotiate, then to demand. Wages, bonuses, privileges, these were not just economic benefits, they were political statements. A soldier who can threaten instability can bargain. A corps that can shut down the capital can extract concessions. And in Istanbul, where politics was not an abstract debate, but a street-level reality, the Janissaries were not just soldiers, they were also, at various times, guardians and enforcers in the city itself, stationed in garrisons, policing neighborhoods, shaping the daily sense of what power felt like to ordinary people. Imagine a city where the most dangerous men are not far away on a frontier. They are at the market. They are near the docks. They are in the coffee houses. They are the ones who can define what order means by simply standing there. That proximity does something to a society. It breeds fear, it breeds dependence, and it breeds a particular kind of corruption. The quiet kind that feels like gravity, where everyone adjusts their behavior to the presence of armed men who are simultaneously official and untouchable. The Janissaries had rituals too, rituals that gave their identity a sacred glow. One of the most famous symbols was the cauldron, the communal pot. It sounds almost quaint until you understand its purpose. Eating together is a powerful tool. It makes loyalty visceral. In the barracks, the pot was the center of daily life. In the imagination, it became the hearth itself. And the hearth could revolt. The cauldron was not only a symbol of unity, it became a symbol of collective action. The gesture of overturning it turned a domestic object into a political weapon. It was an unmistakable signal. The corps had decided it would not obey. It was a declaration written in metal and soup. There were other ceremonies too, rituals that linked the Janissaries to the palace through choreographed generosity. A famous example is the procession of baklava, trays of sweet pastry sent from the palace to the Janissaries as a sign of favor. In a stable relationship, this kind of ritual is reassurance. The ruler feeds the guardians honor the ruler. In an unstable relationship, it becomes something else, a test. Because when a corps grows powerful enough, even accepting a gift can become political. The question is no longer, is this sweet, But is this submission? The palace watches reactions. The city interprets rumors. The Janissaries measure their own mood like a barometer. A dessert tray becomes a referendum. This is how empires rot, not always with dramatic betrayal, but with symbols that turn into threats. Still, for a long time, the Janissaries were not a story of decay. They were a story of success. Their discipline, organization, and direct connection to central authority helped the Ottoman Empire field a force that could respond quickly and maintain continuity. They contributed to the Ottoman ability to hold territory, to garrison cities, to project power. And yet, success contains the seeds of its own instability. An elite core is like a blade. It can defend the state, but it can also cut the hand that holds it. The more effective it is, the more the state relies on it. The more the state relies on it, the more it can demand. And the more it can demand, the more it can begin to imagine itself as the state. That psychological transformation is the true arc of the Janissaries, from instrument to stakeholder, from stakeholder to kingmaker, from kingmaker to obstacle, from obstacle to target. There is a reason the most frightening moment in this entire history is not a battle against an external enemy, but a confrontation inside the capital. When you reach the point where the government's greatest threat is the force created to protect it, you are watching a system devour itself. The Janissaries did not only threaten from the shadows. At times, they played roles in palace politics so direct that later memory struggled to process it. Sultans could be pressured, reforms could be blocked, officials could be removed. The core became entangled in the dense web of factional struggles that define imperial capitals everywhere. This entanglement is where the story becomes a thriller, because it introduces a frightening uncertainty. Who truly rules? In a stable monarchy, the army obeys the throne. In a fragile monarchy, the throne tries to appease the army. In a broken monarchy, the army decides which throne will exist. One of the most shocking historical facts associated with the Janissaries is that a core created to serve could become involved in the violent removal of authority figures at the top. The details vary across episodes and centuries, and the politics are never one-dimensional, but the pattern is clear. Once a military corps believes it has the right to enforce its interests, it stops being a tool and starts being an actor. And once it is an actor, it does what actors do. It seeks survival, influence, and reward. Now the rot accelerates. The early Janissary ideal included a separation from ordinary civilian life, an emphasis on discipline, and a controlled recruitment system. Over time, those boundaries blurred. Marriage, trade, and civilian occupations, once restricted in principle, became more common in practice. The core expanded, and with expansion came dilution. New admissions could be influenced by patronage and bribery rather than strict selection. In some eras, being Janissary could become a status as much as a combat role. This is another shock. An elite unit can survive as a name even when the reality underneath changes. The Janissary core grew into something like a social class. Being connected to it could mean protection, income, and local power. You could see Janissary influence not just in military formations, but in urban guilds, marketplaces, and everyday disputes. The line between soldier and civilian blurred until it became a smudge. When a core becomes a class, it doesn't want war. War is risk. War is discipline. War is death. A class wants stability. A class wants predictable income. A class wants control over its environment. And this is where the empire's nightmare becomes inevitable. Because the modern world, gunpowder tactics evolving, European militaries reforming, administrative structures changing, the conversation was unavoidable. But reform is not just a policy, it is an insult. If your identity is built on being the elite, a new elite is not an improvement, it is a replacement.
The Janissaries had resisted reforms before. Reform attempts could trigger unrest because reforms threatened their privileges, their economic roles, and their political leverage. And the state, trapped in dependence, often negotiated rather than confronted. Each negotiation taught the core the same lesson: pressure works. So the cycle repeated. The empire tried to modernize. The core resisted. The empire backed down. The core gained confidence. The empire grew weaker. By the time Mahmud II came to the throne, the problem was no longer abstract, it was existential. Mahmud II understood something that earlier rulers had struggled to face. You cannot modernize an empire while a powerful internal group has a veto over every change. You cannot build a disciplined new force while an old force can riot the moment discipline is demanded. You cannot be sovereign while another actor inside your capital behaves like a co-sovereign. But confronting the Janissaries directly was dangerous. This was not a marginal group. This was an institution with centuries of prestige, networks in the city, and an ability to mobilize violence. So the state did what states often do when they cannot win openly. It prepared quietly. This is where the story becomes genuinely suspenseful, because it resembles a chess match played with human lives. Mahmud II worked toward building a new military structure and reforming the army, but he had to manage perception, timing, and justification. He needed a pretext that would make crushing the Janissaries look not like a personal vendetta, but like a necessity for public order. And then he needed courage, because once the confrontation began, there would be no safe half measure. Either the Janissaries would crush the reform and remain kingmakers, or the state would crush the Janissaries and redefine sovereignty by force. In June 1826, the moment arrived. The empire announced a new military formation aligned with reformist goals. The Janissaries responded the way they had responded before, with uprising signals, mobilization, and the old language of collective refusal. The cauldrons were overturned. The old symbol returned, loud as thunder. For centuries, that had been a negotiating position. This time, it was evidence. Mahmud II moved quickly. He declared the rebels enemies of order. He called loyal forces and reformist troops. He used artillery. And then, in a moment that still reads like myth because it is so brutal and so final, the empire turned its cannons toward the barracks of the core that had once been the shield of the throne. This is the auspicious incident, a phrase that should unsettle you precisely because of its cold optimism. Auspicious means favorable, blessed, promising. The word is a propaganda blade. It frames mass violence as good fortune. But the facts are stark. The Janissary core was crushed. Many were killed in the confrontation. Many were executed afterward. The institution was abolished. Its property and networks were dismantled. Its associated religious and social structures, especially those linked in tradition and memory with Janissary identity, were targeted as well. That is the third shock. The state did not simply disband a military unit, it attempted to erase a cultural ecosystem. When the smoke cleared, the Janissaries as an institution were gone. The empire could proceed with reforms in a new direction. But the disappearance of an institution does not erase the psychological logic that created it. Now step back and absorb the full arc, because it is as haunting as any thriller plot. First, the empire takes children from families, not by accident, but by design, turning them into a central military household that owes everything to the ruler. This creates an elite core with discipline and continuity, capable of extraordinary effectiveness.
Then the core becomes powerful enough to demand privileges, shape policy, and intervene in politics. Its rituals, cauldrons, ceremonies, gifts become a political language understood by everyone in the capital. Then, over time, the core changes, boundaries blur, privileges expand, admission becomes less controlled. The institution becomes a class with economic and social interests. Then, when the state tries to reform itself to survive in a changing world, the core resists, because reform threatens its identity and power. Then, finally, the state decides to survive by destroying what it once built. Cannons fire not at foreign walls, but at the heart of its own old system. The hearth is extinguished. In other words, the empire created a weapon that became a political organism and then had to kill it. This is not only Ottoman history. It is a universal pattern, and that is why it holds attention like a grip on the throat. You can watch the pattern echo in any society where a security force becomes an interest group, where an elite becomes insulated, where privileges become hereditary, where reform becomes betrayal, where the state becomes hostage to its own guardians. But what makes the Janissary story uniquely disturbing is the beginning, because the beginning reveals the moral price of building a force that is loyal beyond family. You have to break family. Even if you emphasize the complexities, cases where families sought the Devşirme because it could lead to high status, cases where the system varied by time and place, the central fact remains hard to soften. The empire institutionalized the removal and transformation of children. It made identity into policy. And that is the real suspense behind the whole story. Because once you accept identity as policy, you open a door that is difficult to close. The Janissary core was famous for discipline in its early centuries, but discipline does not cancel the trauma of origin. It merely redirects it. When a human being is shaped by the state from childhood, their loyalty can become absolute, but so can their dependence. Their sense of belonging is real, but it is also engineered. Their pride is real, but it is also a substitute for something taken.
That is why the cauldron symbol matters. It is not just a sign of we eat together. It is a sign of we belong here, because we no longer belong anywhere else. Now consider how frightening that is when such men gain political power. They are not only defending pay, they are defending the only home they have. This, too, is a historical lesson. When you create an institution that becomes someone's entire identity, reform becomes existential. Reform is not paperwork, it is annihilation. And people fight annihilation with everything they have. Mahmud II understood this. That is why he did not attempt to retrain the Janissaries into a new modern core. He chose eradication. And the eradication became a message to the entire empire. The state will not share sovereignty. Here is another unsettling detail. The Janissaries were once a sign of centralization, proof that the Sultan could project authority through a loyal standing force. Their destruction, too, was an act of centralization, proof that the state could reclaim monopoly over coercion by force. In both cases, the empire sought the same thing: control. The difference is that in the beginning, control was built through a pipeline of children. In the end, control was restored through cannon fire in the capital. That is why the story holds the mind. It is not a simple narrative of good soldiers turned bad. It is a narrative of institutions that evolve beyond their original purpose. It is a narrative of power and the way power always demands a price. If you are looking for the most shocking fact to keep a reader pinned, it may not be the cannonade of 1826. It may not be the political revolts. It may not be the executions.
Those are dramatic, but history is full of drama. The most shocking fact is that the system was, for a time, considered normal. That people could live in a world where a state could claim children as a resource, where a military corps could exist as a social class inside a city, where a cauldron could be a political threat, where dessert trays could be interpreted as signals, where the line between soldier and shopkeeper could blur until the army sat inside the marketplace, and all of this could be absorbed into the daily rhythm of life. Normalization is more frightening than violence because violence can be condemned. Normalization becomes invisible. And invisibility is how institutions endure long enough to become monsters. Even the name Janissary contains a quiet horror when translated literally, new soldier. New compared to what? New compared to the old loyalties, family, village, faith traditions, language habits, childhood memories. New compared to the identity that existed before the state intervened. The Corps did not merely train soldiers, it manufactured new people. When that manufacturing worked, it produced an elite that terrified rivals. When it worked too well, it produced an elite that terrified the state. In the end, the Janissary story is not just the story of a corps. It is the story of a state testing the limits of social engineering and discovering that engineered loyalty can mutate into engineered power. And once power exists, it does not like to be re-engineered. So the empire did not re-engineer. It detonated. If you return mentally to that night in 1826, you can now hear the deeper sound behind the cannons. It is not only the sound of wood splintering and masonry collapsing. It is the sound of a centuries-old bargain ending. The bargain had been this: the state will give you belonging, status, and a place at the center of power if you become what we need, not what you were. For generations, that bargain built an empire's muscle. Then the muscle refused to take new orders, and the empire, desperate to survive in a changing world, decided it would rather bleed than be strangled.
That is why the Auspicious incident was considered auspicious. Not because it was moral, not because it was merciful, but because it broke a deadlock that threatened the future of the state. History is often written as a sequence of victories and defeats, but the most important moments are sometimes internal surgeries, moments when a system decides which part of itself it will sacrifice to keep living. The Janissaries were that sacrifice. If you want one last twist, one final hook to leave the reader unsettled, hold on to the cauldron again. An overturned cauldron was rebellion. The cauldron upright was unity. Both were true. Both were dangerous. Because the same symbol that created loyalty also created the ability to act together against the throne. The same hearth that fed soldiers also fed revolt. The same shared pot that made them brothers made them a bloc. And a bloc, once it recognizes itself, becomes political whether it wants to or not. The Janissary Corps began as an innovation in military organization. It ended as a warning about institutional power. And the warning is simple enough to repeat, but hard enough to accept. The state that builds an elite force to control others must eventually confront the possibility that the force will seek to control the state. And if the force is built by breaking people early, by replacing their first loyalties with manufactured ones, then the state is not only building soldiers, it is building a new kind of human bond, a bond that can become unbreakable, until the day the cannons turn inward.